I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Ukraine, Crimea, the face-off between the Kremlin and Washington, between the EU and Russia. That story over these last weeks has turned into what looks to be the Cold War here in the 21st century, without nukes being launched on warning, but certainly with the apparatus of intelligence gathering and media of two or three large empires. The European Empire, if you'll forgive me, around Berlin, the Russian Empire around Moscow, and then Washington and its colleagues reporting on Russia. I welcome now Professor Steve Cohen, a Russian history professor at New York University, who has guided me these many years watching this conflict between Washington and the Kremlin. We started our conversation during the Georgia crisis in serious moments because Steve at that time knew that what Georgia's ambition of joining EU, joining NATO, was also Ukraine's ambition. And here we are in 2014 with the conflict at hand, with senators and congressmen and parliamentarians in Russia all using the word sanctions, a face-off that looks destructive to everybody's economy. Professor, a very good evening to you. Where are we in this conflict generally before we get into the specifics of the week?
John, I don't want to exaggerate, so let me choose my words as carefully as possible. I think we're drifting, not yet racing, but drifting toward actual war. Let me reword that. There is a danger that we are drifting toward war for the first time in history between the United States and Russia. The triggering devices would be this, that there's a clamor in Europe, in the European Union, and in Washington to move NATO troops to the Polish West Ukrainian border, not into Ukraine, but to the border. Remember, Poland is a member of NATO. If that happens, Putin will be under tremendous pressure, and he's not making these decisions by himself. He's the decider, as George Bush used to say. But he has people around him who represent powerful forces in Russian politics. He will be under pressure if NATO troops are moved to the Ukrainian border. To move those, you remember last week he practiced 150,000 Russian troops in Russia.
Yes, Leningrad district,
right?
Yes.
And he sent them back to the barracks. He will be under pressure to send those troops into the whole of eastern and southern Ukraine. And then you're at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then it's one misstep to war. Now, meanwhile, one other point. The White House has taken the view that the government in Kiev is legitimate. The one that came to power through a kind of street coup d'etat on February 22nd when the president fled, and Yanukovych, he's in Russia. Russia refuses to recognize the Kiev government as legitimate because it has no standing in law, international or constitutional. And yet, Kerry Obama proposal for a way out is for the Russians to talk directly with a government they regard as illegitimate. This is a non-starter. And today, Kerry sent a message to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, which they printed, sent out on their wire, saying that if you, Russia, don't back down in Crimea, which they're not going to do, there's no point in having any more talks about anything. Well, if you don't have any talks, then I guess it's war. So that's why I say there's the danger of this drift.
I want to report to you, Steve, because I've been having conversations the last week into Ukraine, and it's a very large country with, once upon a time they called the Austro-Hungarian Empire the saucepan of nations. I'm beginning to think that Ukraine is the saucepan of nations. It's made up of moving parts from different historical periods in between Europe and Asia. And I spoke earlier with Lviv on the westernmost border near Poland, a city that was Polish at one point, part of the Second Polish Republic after the First War. And Lviv looks at Kiev and looks at Crimea very profoundly differently from Simferopol, which I also talked to, the capital of Crimea. And a week ago, after we talked, I spoke with Donetsk, which is the industrialized city well to the east of Ukraine, Russian Russian-dominated, and it's very much part of the Russian industrial empire, so it's completely integrated into the Russian economy. These three cities, and you can interpret for my audience, these three cities represent very different points of view. And I'll begin with Lviv because I spoke with, and I'll run it later on tonight. Everyone can listen for themselves, with a young man named Roman Skasky, who is a Ukrainian born in New York, but he's now returned to Lviv, and he lives there. He's an entrepreneur. He makes the point that many of the Ukrainians in America, especially the fourth wave or the third wave that came here after the Second War, were from Western Ukraine, the part of Ukraine that is now embracing or seems to have all the energy for the new government in Kiev. And they fled because after the war, they were to be repatriated as Soviet citizens, and they knew that was death with Stalin. So they fled, they begged, some committed suicide. It was a cruel moment as the displaced persons that were Ukrainians were turned back to horror under the Soviet regime. They're here in America as fervently anti-Soviet, fervently anti-Russian. That is the Ukrainian voice in America. I also spoke to Simferopol, to Matt Kaminsky. I will listen to him later tonight. He is Wall Street Journal reporting in the streets of Simferopol, the capital. He reports that the Russians there are called the Men in Green, because no one wears insignia, so that's what the people refer to them. They're guarding all the public buildings. However, there are not so many of them. It doesn't have the aura of a military occupation. The tragedy in Crimea, I learned, Steve, and I need your interpretation on this, and we have time to talk about it, are the Crimean Tatars, who returned after the fall of the Soviet Union from their displacement and cruelty by the Soviet regime, came back from Siberia. There are several 100,000 of them living on Crimea, and they believe that they're going to be exiled or driven out again by the Russian spirit. And then we have Donetsk, which is an industrialized, rich, and powerful city. So those are the three cities I lay out to you, Professor, and I'd like to begin with Lviv and your point of view of what we're seeing in Western Ukraine now as Ukraine spins into this conflict.
Well, let me generalize, because you were talking about, I forget how you put it, a saucepan.
Saucepan of nations, yes.
It's as though God, in making history, if you take that view, collected up a bunch of diverse ethnic, linguistic folks and kind of scattered them on a large area and called it Ukraine, which comes from the Russian word on the edge. Kraina means edge, Ukraina means at the edge, Ukraine. We Americans, who prided ourselves on being a melting pot, should understand the first part of this. Our forefathers came here from every which place, but for the most part they did melt into a pot. In Ukraine, because they were geographically in different places, they never really melted. Ukraine is a state, but it's not a country. At a minimum, it's 2, maybe 3 countries. It's the state that's collapsed since February 21st, approximately. And what we have left are these diverse points of view from diverse people that you reported on. And I wish that the American networks would report on this, but they just stay in one place as though that's the truth. But anywhere you go in Ukraine today, whether you go to Crimea or Lviv or to Donetsk or to Kiev or further west, you're going to get different points of view. And the political range, let's be honest, in Ukraine today, in the territory, ranges from just plain fascist, and they have their own political parties and their own movement, and one of them is going to run for the presidency, to liberal Democrats. The fascists are a minority, but they may be the tail that wags the dog, and that's the danger. You got all these tails wagging the dog. The dog is American-Russian relations. And you got all these parts of Ukraine wagging. And, of course, you know what you discovered, that you get one perspective in Lviv, and one in Donetsk, and one in Crimea. Now, one last word. We Americans shouldn't find that all that hard to understand because of a certain generation, at least. I grew up in the Deep South, segregated South, and folks, when I was growing up, had a completely different perspective on everything than did the Yankees, the damned Yankees. And that kind of eased its edges over years in America. But these kinds of edges haven't been smoothed out in Ukraine, partly because the 74-year Soviet Union, of which the whole of Ukraine was part, kind of held them all together, either by coercion or language or the central state or the army or whatever. And when the Soviet Union disintegrated, all these pieces went their separate ways. And that's what we're witnessing in Ukraine today.
I'm speaking to Professor Steve Cohen, New York University Russian history. When we come back, we'll speak of this saucepan of nations, especially the shadow that is Stalinism, that hangs over so many of the stories I hear from Western, Eastern, and Crimea. The remembrance of the cruelty and the abandonment by the rest of the world of the people of Ukraine. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show, and we're coming back with more stories from Ukraine.